I first noticed her in the quiet corner of the library where the rain streaked against the tall windows, blotting the light into shades of gray and silver. She was hunched over a stack of books that seemed heavier than they should be, her fingers tracing the edges of pages, as if seeking something invisible. I hadn't intended to approach anyone that evening. Usually, I come here to think, to lose myself in words that aren't mine. But there was something about the subtle tension in her shoulders that pulled me closer without thought. She glanced up, startled, as if sensing me. "Oh, sorry," she muttered, her voice a fragile thread stretched tight across the space between us. I smiled, a small, calm curve of acknowledgement, and gestured toward the empty chair beside her. "It's fine," I said. "You can sit." For a long moment, she hesitated. Then she eased into the seat, her eyes darting back to the books but not really seeing them. There was a quiet struggle in the way her hands clenched and unclenched, a rhythm of someone holding themselves together with invisible threads. I didn't ask questions. I didn't push. I only offered the space beside me, the simple proof of presence. Sometimes that is all it takes. Then she said it, almost in a whisper, barely audible over the rustle of pages. "I'm tired of pretending I'm strong." The words lingered between us, soft but heavy, carrying the weight of nights I could only imagine. I leaned slightly closer, careful not to crowd her, and said without hesitation, "Then rest here in my lap." Her eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief mingling with relief, and for a heartbeat the library felt larger, yet intimately small, containing only that moment the quiet heartbeat of mutual recognition. She didn't move immediately. She simply let herself breathe, letting the edges of tension dissolve just enough to trust, if only slightly, that she could be seen without pretense. I watched her for a few moments, feeling the faint tremor in her shoulders and the small intake of breath as she let herself exist beyond performance. I didn't speak. I simply waited, grounding myself in stillness so that she could anchor in it too. The rain fell in steady lines against the windows, rhythmic and forgiving, like the pulse of the world slowing to match ours. Then she rested her head gently against me, and I understood that presence, quiet and unassuming, could hold more strength than any words could muster. In that small, rain-muted corner of the library, the unspoken trust between us was fragile, yet unmistakably real. It was a beginning, though neither of us said so. The books around us blurred into insignificance, and the only story that mattered was the one we were starting to write in silence, together. The cafe was quiet, though not entirely empty. Rain still tapped softly against the windows, drawing thin rivulets that mirrored the subtle tremor I sensed in her hands as she fidgeted with the teacup between us. I chose a corner table, one tucked away so the world outside felt distant, and slid into the seat opposite her without a word. Sometimes words insist on coming too soon, but today I wanted stillness, a small room of calm we could inhabit together. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, watching the liquid ripple as though each circle might carry away some unspoken worry. Her gaze flicked to mine for a moment, hesitant, as if measuring what I might see, what I might judge. I gave her nothing to measure. I only offered the space to exist, and in that offering, I realized that quiet presence could sometimes be more profound than speech. Minutes passed. The cafe hummed gently around us, muffled voices, the soft clink of cups, the whiff of chamomile and sugar. She exhaled, a faint tremor in her shoulders that betrayed her tension, and I didn't ask why. Not yet. I only held the chair steady across from her, a silent anchor. She leaned back, letting herself take in the moment, and in the slowest of ways, the storm inside her seemed to lessen, even if only slightly. Finally, her voice broke the silence, soft and raw. "I don't know why I always feel like I have to manage everything alone." There was a fragility there, a thread of honesty that wasn't often offered to strangers, but I wasn't a stranger. I only nodded, keeping my hands relaxed on the table, signaling that it was safe to continue. I'm scared of letting people in." Her eyes fixed on the rim of the cup, as though it held answers she couldn't speak aloud. I leaned forward, just slightly, enough that my presence was tangible but not intrusive. "Then take your time," I said. "You don't have to rush. You can rest here for as long as you need." The faintest exhale of relief brushed her lips. She met my eyes briefly, and in that flash of connection, the distance between us felt smaller, a fragile bridge being built of trust. No grand gestures, no urgency, just the careful unfolding of someone letting themselves be held, even for a moment. She tilted her head, almost shyly, and allowed herself to linger there, in a place where she could just breathe. I didn't attempt to fill the quiet with chatter or advice. I simply existed, a constant in the ebb and flow of her nerves, steady enough that she could feel her shoulders loosen. Around us, the world carried on, the barista calling out orders, the soft hiss of steaming milk. But within our little corner, time slowed, and the space between us softened into something unexpectedly real. For a long while, we didn't speak again. And yet, in that silence, I could sense the beginning of something tentative, a thread of belonging forming between us. Something had shifted. She no longer clutched her cup like a shield. She held it loosely, lightly, and in that gesture, I understood that a small fragment of trust had been placed in me. That was enough. Her message arrived mid-morning, simple and unadorned. "Do you have time today?" My phone buzzed in my pocket, and for a moment I hesitated, considering the ordinary rhythm of my day. Then I smiled. I had time. Time to exist without schedule, without expectation, simply to be present. I replied, "I do." When I arrived, she was waiting outside her apartment, umbrella tilted against the drizzle. The wind tugged lightly at her hair, brushing it across her face. She pushed it away with a half-hearted laugh, that nervous, delicate sound that seemed to hover in the air longer than it should. She didn't say much as we walked, merely falling into step beside me. The silence was comfortable, a quiet acknowledgement that we were both capable of existing without filling every second. We found ourselves on a bench in the small park across the street, leaves slick with droplets clinging to branches like tiny lanterns. She fidgeted with the strap of her bag, then admitted quietly, "I'm trying to figure out if I should move back home for a while. My parents, they worry, and I don't want to disappoint them." But her voice faltered, and the sentence hung in the air, unfinished. I didn't offer solutions. I only listened, leaning slightly forward, letting the weight of my attention tell her that she could speak without fear of interruption or judgment. After a moment, I asked, calmly, "Do you want to?" No pressure, no implied expectation, just a question carried in the tone of someone who genuinely wanted her answer to me. She looked at me, surprise flashing across her face. I don't know," she admitted. Her hands twisted together, a small gesture of vulnerability, real and unpracticed. I said, "Then take your time. You don't have to decide today, not with me." My words were simple, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders ease a fraction. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing some invisible weight, and nodded. For the first time, I thought I saw her let herself imagine a choice that wasn't dictated by fear or obligation. We stayed on the bench a while longer. She spoke in small fragments about her job, the books she'd been reading, the tiny pleasures she allowed herself when the world didn't demand perfection. I responded lightly, sharing bits of my own days, not in competition, but in accompaniment. There was no rush, no forced intimacy, only the subtle, deliberate construction of trust, brick by brick. At some point, she laughed softly, a sound that felt lighter than before, and I realized she was beginning to feel seen, not as a performance, but as herself. I didn't celebrate it aloud. I didn't need to. The way she looked at the puddles forming in the park, then back at me with a quiet relief in her eyes, told me everything. When it was time to go, she hesitated, then said, almost shyly, "Thank you for being here." I smiled, a calm and certain curve of reassurance. "I'm here whenever you need." She returned my smile with a subtle, genuine lift of her lips, and we walked back toward the streetlights together, the rain softening, leaving only the scent of wet earth and the promise of beginnings. We were walking along the narrow paths of the park, leaves wet underfoot, when she suddenly asked, almost shyly, "What does the name Grace mean to you?" I paused mid-step, surprised by the question. Names often carry stories, but hers felt like it had weight, a presence I couldn't ignore. I looked at her, noticing the way her fingers traced the edge of a puddle, hesitant but curious, and I answered slowly, "It's something that arrives quietly, when you don't expect it, but changes everything." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the ground, letting the words settle. I could feel the subtle shift in her posture, the easing of some invisible tension. She finally lifted her eyes, those soft, wary eyes that had been scanning the world as if to measure its danger, and smiled faintly. "I've never thought of it," she said, almost to herself. We walked further, the city around us muted by the rhythm of our steps and the distant patter of rain. She spoke hesitantly about past relationships, her voice dropping at times when the memories were too sharp. She described a love that had been controlling, suffocating, leaving her always second-guessing herself. I didn't interrupt or try to offer solutions. I only listened, and the act of listening, patient and unwavering, seemed to matter more than any advice I could have given. "You really just listen," she said finally, her voice almost fragile. I nodded. "I do," I said simply. "Sometimes, that's all anyone needs." Her shoulders relaxed fractionally. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was a quiet affirmation, a place where she could exist without pretense. We reached a small fountain, its water reflecting the gray sky. She crouched down to examine a cluster of moss clinging to the stone, and I followed her gaze, letting the moment stretch between us. "I've always felt like I needed to hold myself together," she admitted, almost a whisper. "It's exhausting." I reached out, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that was neither commanding nor invasive. Then let yourself not hold it all, I said softly. You don't have to carry everything alone. She leaned slightly into the touch, a subtle acknowledgement that she trusted the space we were creating, a bridge built from patience and quiet presence. She laughed softly, a sound lighter than before, and for a moment, the park seemed smaller, contained in the intimacy of our steps and the slow unfolding of trust. As we walked back toward the street, I realized that these small moments, words shared, silences honored, laughter allowed, were becoming the threads of something fragile but undeniable. Something was forming between us, not forced, not hurried, just quietly real. The evening light faded behind the building, and she looked at me, a question in her eyes that didn't need to be spoken. I nodded gently. I'm here, I said, whenever you need. Her smile, brief but genuine, carried a weight of relief I couldn't ignore. I didn't expect to see her at the market that Saturday afternoon. The sky had cleared after an early drizzle, leaving the air fresh and faintly sweet with wet pavement and the lingering scent of flowers from the small urban gardens nearby. She stood in the produce aisle, brow furrowed, list in hand, glancing between the vegetables with attention I knew well from earlier. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to interrupt, but then I realized she didn't need interruption. She needed quiet presence, someone to walk beside her without expectation. Matthew, she said, noticing me, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Her tone was casual, but I detected the underlying nervous energy she often carried. I smiled, adjusting the strap of my backpack. Hey, I said, keeping my voice light. Looks like you've got a busy afternoon. She laughed softly, a sound mingled with embarrassment. Yeah, I'm trying to get everything done before the weekend hits. It's just a lot. She held up her list, scanning it as though the inked words could multiply themselves in completion. I nodded, understanding the quiet weight of tasks that never seemed to end. I didn't offer to take over or rush her. Instead, I walked alongside her, matching her pace. When she struggled with a particularly heavy bag of apples, I lifted it without a word, placing it gently in her cart. She stared for a moment, as if weighing whether this was an intrusion or a simple act of ease. I only nodded, subtle and steady, signaling that it was neither. She exhaled, a soft chuckle escaping. You're reliable, half teasing, half grateful. The rest of the shopping went by quietly, with her moving through the aisles, occasionally glancing at me, occasionally returning to her list. When she paused at the checkout, a little overwhelmed by the small chaos of items and people, I moved up beside her, stacking the groceries onto the conveyor. No words were necessary. My presence itself was an unspoken assurance. After paying, she suggested we go upstairs for tea, a pause after the mundane but heavy chores. I agreed, following her up the narrow staircase, careful not to crowd or rush. Once we reached her small kitchen, she moved to make tea while I unpacked the bags, the rhythm familiar and comfortable. We exchanged small comments about the groceries, her selections, the weather outside, but the conversation wasn't the focus. The focus was the quiet intimacy of shared space, of two lives intersecting without demand or expectation. She poured the tea, handing me a cup, and I took it, noticing the slight tremor in her fingers. I reached out lightly, letting my hand brush hers, a gesture of gentle steadiness. She smiled, a quiet warmth spreading across her face. And I realized that in these unremarkable, ordinary moments, trust was being built. She was allowing herself to be seen, to be supported, to exist without pretense. As we settled into the small sofa by the window, rain from earlier glistening on the panes, she sighed, a sound that spoke of relief and subtle recognition. Thank you for today, she said softly. I smiled, letting my eyes meet her. Anytime, I replied. I'm here. She led me to her small living room, where the late afternoon light spilled across the floor in pale streaks. The window was wide, framed by thin curtains that fluttered slightly with the faint breeze, and outside, the city moved in a muted rhythm. Grace stood by it, her hands resting lightly on the sill, eyes tracing the patterns of people moving below, as if she were searching for something she could never quite reach. I watch the world from here, she said softly, almost to herself. Sometimes it feels safer than being in it. Her voice carried a fragile honesty, one that hadn't been offered to many, and I stayed still, letting her speak without interruption. There was a pause, the kind that stretches comfortably, allowing space for thought to settle. I feel like nobody really sees me, she added, her gaze distant. I stepped closer, careful not to crowd her, and said quietly, I see you. My words were simple, unembellished, but they carried the weight of intention. She turned her head slightly toward me, and in that glance, I saw a flicker of disbelief mixed with hope, the kind that arrives when trust begins to root itself quietly. She exhaled slowly, a release of tension she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned against the sill, and I moved next to her, letting my presence be felt without forcing it. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the fragile quiet we had created. We didn't speak at first. I watched the slight rise and fall of her shoulder, the way her fingers traced the frame of the window, and the subtle way her posture relaxed, as though she had allowed herself to be seen and held without having to perform. After a while, she rested her head lightly on my shoulder. The gesture was unspoken but intimate, an acknowledgement of trust without urgency, a willingness to exist beside someone without fear. I didn't respond verbally. I didn't need to. I simply adjusted slightly, ensuring that my presence was steady, grounding. The moment stretched between us, a quiet cocoon insulated from the outside world. We remained there for what felt like hours, not through conversation but through shared silence, a gentle rhythm of breathing and proximity. She shifted slightly, sighing, a small but significant release, and I felt the subtle, almost imperceptible way she was beginning to let go of the constant vigilance she carried. "I can breathe here," she whispered finally, a delicate admission that held both relief and cautious hope. I tightened my hold subtly, not possessively, but as a silent promise. "You are safe here." Outside the window, shadows lengthened, the sun dipping lower, but inside, the quiet lingered. A fragile trust had taken root, and in the small intimacy of that shared space, I realized that beginnings didn't always announce themselves with words. They arrived in gestures, in the steady presence of someone willing to stay. She brought out a small, worn box the next time I visited. The kind of box that carries a lifetime of memories without explanation. The kind that smells faintly of paper, dust, and moments held too tightly. She opened it carefully, revealing a collection of letters, each folded neatly, inked words, sometimes smudged from tears or haste. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched them, a quiet hesitation that suggested both reverence and fear. "These are letters I never sent," she said softly, her voice threading through the small living room. "To people I wanted to say things to, but never could. Or letters to myself, reminders I didn't want to forget." She lifted one, unfolding it gently, and began to read aloud. The words were intimate, private, carrying confessions and unspoken fears, wishes that had lingered too long in the quiet. I listened, as always, patient, allowing each word to settle without interruption. Her voice wavered at times, breaking on syllables heavy with emotion. I didn't offer commentary. There was no need to. The act of listening, of simply being present while she bared parts of herself she had hidden for years, was enough. When she finished the first letter, she looked at me with an almost startled vulnerability, as if seeing someone witness her truths was itself a revelation. "Do you think it's silly?" she asked, almost whispering, as though the question could vanish if answered incorrectly. I shook my head. "Not at all," I said. "It takes courage to acknowledge what you've carried alone. That's not silly." She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders loosening fractionally. I suggested gently, "Instead of writing another letter, maybe you could try something different. A list of things you want to invite into your life. Simple things. Real things." She looked at me, surprise softening into curiosity. "A list?" she murmured. I nodded. "Yes. Things that matter to you. Things you can act on, even in small ways. Not words lost to paper, but steps toward what you want." She paused, considering, and then slowly nodded. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her posture, a softening that indicated she trusted the suggestion, that she was willing to engage in a new form of vulnerability. I didn't push. I simply watched, my presence steady, my calm a quiet assurance she could rely on. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, her writing slowly, pens scratching softly on blank sheets, while I read nearby. The room was filled with the quiet rustle of paper, the occasional pause to think, the gentle murmur of words not meant for anyone else but her. I noticed the small smile that occasionally lifted the corners of her lips, a subtle lightness returning to her eyes, a delicate sign that she was beginning to feel less alone. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor, she had completed a page of modest, tangible desires. To walk more, to watch sunsets without rushing, to meet new people slowly, carefully. I glanced at her, calm and steady, and said simply, "I'll be here for any of them you want to share." Her eyes softened, a quiet trust lingering, unspoken but understood. Sunday arrived with a soft, hesitant sun, spilling warmth into the small balcony she called her garden. Grace greeted me with a quiet smile, her hair slightly tousled from sleep, her eyes reflecting a calm I hadn't seen before. She handed me a pair of gloves, not with command, but with the simple trust that I would join her in the care of her small, green world. We moved among the pots and planters, the soil dark and rich beneath our fingers, the scent of earth and leaves mingling in the air. She explained which plants required more attention, her voice steady, the nervous tension I had grown accustomed to replaced with a subtle joy. I followed her instruction, gently loosening soil, adjusting small stems, placing each plant with care. In these ordinary tasks, there was an unspoken intimacy, a rhythm that needed no words. Grace laughed softly when a small sprig of rosemary tipped over. She straightened it carefully, murmuring apologies to the plant as though it had feelings. I smiled, a quiet amusement in my chest, and offered a comment about how attentive she was even to the smallest detail. She looked at, and the faintest blush warmed her cheeks. "I guess I just care," she admitted, almost shyly. We worked side by side for hours, occasionally pausing to admire a new leaf or to wipe the dirt from our hands. The conversations were light, memories of past gardens, small childhood stories, but always interlaced with silence that spoke more than words could. She was beginning to relax into the space, her shoulders unburdened, her eyes brighter. I noticed the subtle way she lingered near me, a quiet acknowledgement that my presence was safe, steady, and without pressure. At one point, she stepped back and observed the entire balcony, sunlight catching the dew on leaves. I feel lighter today," she murmured. There was no drama in her tone, no exaggerated declaration, just a simple honesty that held more weight than any words spoken loudly. I nodded, placing a hand lightly on a pot beside her. "I knew this day would come," I said softly. "You just needed the time to breathe." The afternoon waned, and shadows stretched across the balcony, painting long patterns of green and gold. Grace leaned against the railing for a moment, eyes closing as if to imprint the calm into memory. I stood nearby, silent, allowing the small triumph of her peace to exist without interruption. In the quiet, I could sense her trust settling deeper, a subtle shift from apprehension to willingness, a gentle opening of the heart. As the day ended, we stepped inside with our hands lightly dusted with soil, the faint scent of earth lingering. She caught my eye and smiled, a smile unburdened, genuine, and quietly radiant. I felt the shift in the air, the sense that something had changed, that in these small, ordinary acts, a bond was growing, fragile but undeniable. The evening air was cooler than I expected as we walked along the quiet streets, leaves rustling softly underfoot. Grace moved beside me with a subtle hesitation, a nervous energy I had come to recognize, yet mingled now with a faint lightness that hadn't been there before. She turned toward me suddenly, eyes searching mine with a question she didn't voice. "I can't tell if this is right," she said softly, almost breaking the fragile rhythm of our steps. I don't know if I'm ready." There was vulnerability in her tone, a real and tangible uncertainty that made my chest tighten in quiet awareness. I didn't rush her. I didn't reach for answers or reassurance that might feel forced. I merely nodded, letting my presence be steady, unintrusive. "You don't need to be," I said gently. "Not now, not ever, if you don't want to. I'm here." My words were simple, but deliberate, the kind that carry weight not by volume, but by certainty. She glanced at me, a flicker of surprise and relief crossing her face, and I could see her beginning to untangle the hesitation she carried like a shadow. We paused at a small bench under a lamppost, the light spilling in soft amber across the... She laughed lightly, nervously, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I never let myself move slowly with someone," she admitted, voice low. "I always feel like I have to go all in or nothing at all." I offered no judgment, no push, only a calm, deliberate acknowledgement of her truth. "Then we don't go all in. Not yet. Not ever. Unless you want to. We move at your pace. I'll follow." She exhaled, a long, quiet release that seemed to carry years of unspoken fear and self-protection. The weight in her shoulders eased slightly. She shifted closer, but not immediately into intimacy. More like proximity, a tentative bridge forming from trust. I noticed the way her hand brushed against mine briefly, a gesture light as air but heavy with significance. She pulled it back quickly, cheeks warming, and I didn't comment. The moment existed perfectly in its subtlety. After a while, she leaned her head on my shoulder, small and tentative, and I felt the quiet, grounding shift in her body, the way she allowed herself to rest without word, without explanation. Outside, the city moved on, but in that pocket of light beneath the lamppost, nothing else mattered. The connection between us had evolved beyond gestures or words. It was steady, intimate, and profoundly patient. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I think I like this." I simply responded with a nod, calm and certain. "Then we continue, as slowly as you need." She exhaled, a fragile but genuine relief, and I knew in that quiet trust, a new chapter of us had begun, unhurried, undemanding, yet undeniable. She fell asleep on the sofa beside me, quiet and unguarded, the kind of sleep that carries relief and subtle trust in its folds. Her hair fanned softly across the cushion, a small cascade of warmth and vulnerability I felt privileged to witness. I didn't move to wake her, didn't disturb the fragile ease that had settled over her. I only adjusted the blanket slightly, letting it cover her shoulders, a small gesture of care without intrusion. The room was muted in the soft light of the morning sun filtering. Shadows stretched lazily across the floor, and the faint hum of the city outside felt distant, irrelevant to the fragile intimacy in that. I sat still, a quiet presence, watching her breathe evenly, allowing myself to simply exist alongside her. No words, no gestures beyond the subtle reassurance that she was seen, held, and unpressured. I reflected on the small steps that had led us here. The library, the cafe, the park, the gentle unfolding of trust through quiet attentiveness and shared silences. Each moment had been a choice, deliberate yet unspoken, and now it all seemed to converge in the ease of her slumber. A fragile yet undeniable acknowledgement that she was safe and could let herself exist without masks. I thought of the letters she had never sent, the plants we had nurtured together, the small pauses and gestures that had built a rhythm of care. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic confessions, only the subtle proof of constancy and presence. And in that constancy, I saw the quiet promise we were crafting, a bond unspoken but deeply understood. The room smelled faintly of tea, of old pages from the letters she had shown me, and of sunlight catching on the wood floor. Each scent, each small detail, was a part of the story we were beginning to tell, not through words alone, but through the steady accumulation of choice, care, and presence. I knew that the trust she had placed in me was delicate, yet resilient, and it was enough to guide every small action I took. I reached for a book on the low table beside me, opening it silently, and began to read while keeping an occasional watchful eye on her. Her breathing was steady, relaxed, and I felt a calm settling over myself as well, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the moment this fragile interlude, was ours. Nothing needed to be forced, nothing needed to. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the small universe we had created in the corner of that apartment. Inside, however, time slowed. Each heartbeat, each subtle shift of her body, was a note in the quiet symphony we were composing together. I knew this was only the beginning, a foundation laid in patience, trust, and presence, with the promise that I would remain a steadfast witness to her life as she allowed herself to open to it. And so I stayed, letting her rest, letting the world pause, understanding that the deepest connections often begin without words, in gestures and silences, in unwavering attention. I did not move, I did not speak. I only existed beside her, carrying the quiet promise that here, in this small, ordinary space, she was chosen, safe, and seen.